Hello, everyone. You've got some folks joining, so we'll give it a minute here. Give it a few more seconds and we'll get started here. Hang on. Okay, here we go. Welcome to our webinar from the National Home Delivery Association. This webinar is actually being presented by our Woman in Home Delivery Council, and it's the Well-Behaved Women Seldom Make History webinar series. And today, the power of gender diversity in the boardroom and C-suite presented by Nancy Eberhardt. But I will actually turn it over to our co-chairs, who are Emily Phillips from XPO Logistics and Patty Johnston with Johnston Risk Advisors. Patty, I'll turn it over to you. Take it from here.
Thanks, Don. A former regional vice president, a former regional bank president, Nancy led several successful mergers and $1 billion in customer relationships. Ford Books released the second edition of her book, Uncommon Candor, A Leader's Guide to Straight Talk in 2018, a topic on which Nancy has blogged and spoken for nearly a decade. Nancy taught business communications and ethics for Jack Welch's executive MBA program and has been a board member of a community bank, a major chamber of commerce, a charitable foundation, a social venture corporation, and the only national park for the performing arts, Virginia Commonwealth University's Intellectual Property Foundation, and a baseball stadium authority. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Nancy Eberhardt.
Thank you so much, Patty. I'm so delighted to be with everyone. I feel like there's probably a number of people on this webinar who could speak a lot to this topic. So I really welcome the interaction that we'll have later in the session. I'd like to start with a picture that I think might be familiar to a number of you. If you're a film buff like I am, this 1957 film, 12 Angry Men, it's one of my favorites. I know that there's probably many of us who walk into a room, even today, and we might be the only woman in the room or the only person of a certain ethnicity. And this film was done in 1957, so 60 years ago, and yet this is still probably going on. I will say they're probably not angry, but we do often find ourselves in a room full of men. And I will also say that this film has been remade 2 times, but if you really want to see some great example of different perspectives in a room, this is actually, the original one is one to go to. Because what it tells us is that every single person in that room has a different perspective about their role in the jury room, and they share a lot of similarity in background. Imagine the diversity you would get if the folks who sit around that table have an even more diverse experience. By the way, it's also a great leadership film. If you want to think about how to really sit at the table in a powerful way and watch Henry Fonda ask the right questions when he doesn't know the answer and influence people to an outcome that we didn't even see coming. But that's one of the powers of being a different kind of voice in a room like this. Let's fast forward to the year 2015. So almost 60 years later, I was at a scaling up conference. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but a lot of businesses from about 5 million to 250 million in size, about 800 people in the room, and about 95% of them are owners, C-suite, or board members of those companies, and they're men. Almost 60 years later from this film. And Tom Peters, who many of you probably know, he's written a number of books that are listed here, and he's most known for the book In Search of Excellence. And he was supposed to speak, I believe it was on the book, The Circle of Innovation that day. And he came off of the dais and he said, I woke up at 3 o'clock this morning and I am not going to talk to you about my book. But I thought about, as I looked at the registrants for this conference, and I thought, what are we doing, men? Why is it that at this date, we still look like this? And he was pretty frosted about it. And he decided to share with the group there for 1 hour and a half about the economic point of view for having women in the C-suite and on the board. And I'm going to share those with you now, or at least some that Tom shared that day, and others that I think are just so demonstrative and make the case that there's an economic reason to do it, and not many people will dispute that. Forget China, India, and the internet. Economic growth is driven by women. Economist magazine. In 2009, at that time, Harvard Business Review reported that women controlled $20 trillion in consumer spending and predicted $28 trillion in the next 5 years. This one won't surprise many of you in this room. Women are the decision makers in 83% of consumer purchases. Now, you might say that's an incredibly high percentage. What about electronics? What about cars? Okay, so for electronics and cars, those percentages tend to be between 50 and 60%. And when we average that with homes and retail purchases and groceries that are up in the high 90s, this is how we get to 83%. It's a staggering figure, I believe. And what's happened now, by 2015, 2016, the commercial purchasing decisions are in the hands of women 50% of the time. The number of purchasing agents and procuring organizations staffed with women. In fact, I recall not too long ago when a government contractor told someone that there was a general that they needed to call on who was doing all the purchasing for an entire region of the world, and that they better not send a man because she wanted to make sure that there was a diverse workforce that was going to be doing this purchasing or providing the supply. And so, in terms of consumers, women are the majority market. And by the way, this came from The Power of the Purse, which was done in 2005. This is not new. Okay. So, Tom Peters' argument, and one that's been carried for quite some time, is that if what you're deciding is that you want to appeal to your customer base, then be very careful if you're not reflecting that customer base at your C-suite and your board. So then folks said, well, if the logic of following the money is not working for you, What else might be a reason to bring women into the C-suite and into the boardroom? McKinsey did a report in the early 2000s about the workforce of the 21st century. And what they said was folks would probably have 7 different careers in their lifetime. And those kids that were in college at that time were going to be doing jobs that didn't even exist when they were in college. And so they said, what are the strengths that are needed for the 21st century workforce? And here are a few that led the list: communication, collaboration, those who value diversity of thought and perspective, and those who appreciate technical and interpersonal skills at the table, not just the IQ about what's being done, but the EQ about doing it in teams with customers, with investors. I believe that these are some of the skills that many women bring forward more of the time than perhaps some men do. And then the argument could be made, well, okay, but should investors even care about this? And I'll talk a little bit about that later, but in particular, I want to put a stake in the ground about one of the probably best known investors, Warren Buffett, as you all know, with Berkshire Hathaway. Now that I want to say probably 90 years old, still renowned as one of the greatest investors in the world. And we have a book by Lofton that says, Warren Buffett invests like a girl, and why you should too. And here's what's interesting. The point is that it is more likely that women will invest in a certain way for the long game. They do a lot of research before they make a decision. Men typically will churn a portfolio more. They'll want to buy more, sell more. Women are more likely to hold an investment that they believe is going to come through. And probably one of the other really remarkable things when the data is looked at around women and men and investing is women tend to be more highly correlated with wanting to feel good personally and ethically about the investment. And Warren Buffett shares that. And what we know is as the baby boomers continue to age, the wealth being passed on to women who outlive men and women in next generation is pretty extraordinary. So maybe you're not convinced yet that the logic is there. And you say, but what if we put women on boards or in the C-suite? Does it help? Does it help to actually have that kind of diversity at the table? And here's some information about that. McKinsey says, when more women are on international corporate boards, they outperform the average company. And one measure that they report consistently is operating profit, 56% higher. What we also know is the pace of women-owned business creation was the fastest in 2018 since 2002, which of course almost always automatically puts women in the board and in the C-suite. And here's an interesting comment that I just found really fascinating. This is about some women and employing women in the workplace and what some people say about it and putting them on the pipeline for C-suite and board. When girls and women earn income, they reinvest 90% in their families. They buy books, medicine, bed nets. For men, the figure is more like 30 to 40%. So again, back a little bit to the girl power that we're starting to see move along here. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't mention that we don't know what the last year is going to do for anything. We all have our belief systems about what's next. But I will tell you, I'm going to take an example of something that has set women back in the last year, but tell you why I'm enthused about the possibilities of the next year. I don't know if many of you saw this, but in the December, January timeframe, there's no doubt that that this last year is causing what's called by many a she-cession, as opposed to a recession. That in fact, women in the workplace, many of them at very high levels, have had to take a step back because of all kinds of implications of COVID. Aging parents, children that are at home, people who have been at jobs where they feel like, or they feel committed enough to family, they feel like they're the ones to step back. So the founder of Girls Who Code and some other women-owned businesses came out with a request that was published in the Washington Post that said, "Dear US Congress, please have a Marshall Plan for moms." Many of you may not remember, but knowing your history, that at the end of the World War, that there was a Marshall Plan in order to try to bring business back. So this is a takeoff on the Marshall Plan for moms that would really give moms and other women who have left the workforce a leg up to come back into the workforce as the pandemic, we hope, continues to let go of its hold on all of us around the world. But that was not the most remarkable part to me. Here was the most remarkable part to me, is this letter, which also appeared in the Washington Post, and it's signed by 50 men, celebrities, athletes, business owners, politicians, heads of all kinds of organizations from all different ethnicities. Think Steph Curry from the NBA, Andrew Yang, who's a presidential candidate and business owner, Arne Duncan, former Secretary of Education, who said, "This matters. We support the Marshall Plan. And now is a time to rebuild our economy and finally value women's work." And when men start to stand for women at this level, I get excited. I think it's really, really a turning point that we're in now. Now, some people will say that I am glasses always half full kind of gal, and the glass is usually crystal, but I really am inspired by some of what I'm seeing now. And some more. 59% of all college degrees at this point have been awarded to women in the last few years. And 50% now of all stockholders are women. Kim Cambrow, who is the chief economist of LinkedIn, spoke at a conference in October, and here's what she said. "We know that people who are looking for jobs are looking for diversity in the C-suite and on boards. And here's how we know. They are searching the websites of the companies that they're considering accepting a job from. And if they do not see diversity in the C-suite, if they don't see gender and ethnicity around the table at the board, then they're deciding that it may not be the organization for them." And what I believe is many of you around this webinar at this Zoom link, we all know that talent is still tough. And if that's a choice that employees are looking to decide whether they're going to join your company or a different one, I think it really matters. And here's a point I want to make. It's also white men who are making these kinds of decisions and looking for diversity. And this may sound a little counterintuitive, but here's what's happening. I'm working with a number of young, very bright, very capable men who actually believe that their chances of being promoted is higher when there's diversity in the C-suite and in boardrooms. And if you think about it, it kind of makes sense. First of all, what they believe is that women are more likely to have a diverse group around them, and that includes white men. And they also believe that there will be more interesting times in those organizations, and that it's possible that women around the table will be saying, we want diversity no matter what. And I will tell you, I'm working with 2 organizations that have recently promoted a woman into the CEO role when it had only been men for the entire history of the organization. And both of those women have said to me, I'm worried that our pipeline does not include men at the moment. They've done such a good job of putting women into the pipeline that they realize that all women is also not our solution. Okay. Another really interesting thing is employment of women in women-owned businesses, up 21% in the decade ending 2018, when overall employment was down in that year. Again, we don't know what COVID has done or how it might impact us in the near term. So now, I also want to show an area where I have some more familiarity is with bank boards. And the Federal Reserve did a really extensive study of bank boards. And by the way, too many bank boards do not have gender diversity. What they found is that there was a positive correlation between gender diversity and bank efficiency and profitability. McKinsey also found it. When there was gender diversity in executive teams, 21% more likely to outperform on profitability, and 27% to have higher likelihood to have superior value creation. Okay. Now, I'm using bank board and C-suite kind of interchangeably, and I actually think it's a little bit chicken and egg. What we know is that when there's more women at the C-suite, there's more women on the board. When there's more women on the board, there's more women in the C-suite. These things go hand in hand. What I will also tell you is some of the data on gender diverse boards does not show these kinds of leaps. The data are actually mixed. And yet one of the predictors about whether you get these numbers that are correlated to be higher value creation and other higher metrics relates to the share of women on the board. And it matters. And by share of women, what I mean is to get the power of diversity, women need to hold at least 3 board seats. This old notion of putting one person on, if you really think about it, it gets very hard for that person to speak for everyone, to have the confidence that their opinion might be worthy of laying on the table, and that maybe if they have a challenging view, it may be harder for it to land on the table if they're a sole voice. I talked to a CEO this morning who is African-American male, and he tells me he's often the only African-American at the board table, on the boards that he's on. And he says it's really hurts his confidence when he's the only one there, because he feels like everybody believes he's speaking for everyone that he looks like. And that's a very hard thing to do. Okay. So how did we get here? We have tons of reasons to say yes to more gender diversity in the C-suite and on boards. And yet, what was in the way? What's still in the way? And I hearken back to a couple of things. First of all the logic in the world can be present, and it just might not matter because our mindset might be in the way. And I'm going to talk about a couple of pieces of that. You know that old saying that you can't get in trouble by hiring IBM? Well, it applies here. Like if people are going to make a move to bring somebody onto a board that they are not golfing with, going to religious services with, in business meetings with all the time. That is scary. And these static boards are uncomfortable about inviting someone to the board that, or the CEO is uncomfortable, that they may not know as well, that they may not feel like sees the world the way they see it, and they feel like there might be a lot of risk and a lot of turmoil. There was a woman who I sat next to at a luncheon, African-American woman, attorney in Washington, who, this was in the year like 2010 or 2011. She was on Continental Airlines board. And I asked her how she got on that board. And of course, every woman within like 2 tables, all of a sudden is like leaning in because everybody's so curious. And you may recall this was a Houston-based airline until they merged with United in 2012 and became the larger United. And she said, I was on this other board and someone on that board was on Continental's board. And after they had years of experience with me on the board, they asked me to come on to Continental's board. Like I was the safe person. So I said, well, what happens now that she's on like 3 or 4 boards, corporate boards, large corporate boards. I said, do you run out of time? And she said, I do. And then people come to ask me to be on their board. And I tell them, here's 4 people I would recommend who look like me. And they say, okay. And then they come back and ask me to be on their board. And she said, I'm the safe one. I'm the one that's been vetted for years. And they keep coming back. And it's true, when you look at the research about board diversity, what you find is it says, we studied 15 women who served on 47 boards. So again, sort of like, it's always safer if somebody's done it before you. And why? Because yes, women on boards do tend to be more likely to ask challenging questions because they're not afraid that they'll hurt the feelings of the CEO, or to ask even curious questions where they're not afraid to deal with the facts of what the answers are. And here's the great news, by the way. When boards are studied that have at least 3 women and women ask challenging questions, suddenly there's improved decision-making for the entire board. Because those who have been on the board for a while start to ask interesting questions too, and become much less about closing ranks and much more about being open to new possibilities. Now, what else has happened that gives me great interest and excitement is that companies and regulatory authorities are beginning to mandate changes. States requiring gender diversity or reporting on diversity with bank boards in the next few years include California, Washington, New York, Maryland, and Illinois, and about 18 other states have some form of legislation in their state legislatures. And what we know is what gets measured gets done. And so a lot of banks now are moving very fast to make their boards more diverse because they do not want to be in a mandated year. They want to do it before the mandate happens. And by the way, these mandates are not new elsewhere. Laws requiring women to comprise at least 40% of public companies, Norway, Spain, France, Iceland. By the way, European countries like Germany and England, the UK, Australia, that have had women in the top job of prime minister or president, you see a lot higher percentage of women at board tables. Again, high leadership begets high leadership. If you go to a country like Japan, where there are not as many women at the highest level, it's about 8% of boards have a woman on corporate boards. Companies are also starting to now mandate. Deloitte, 30% of their board had women, have their 30% of their board are women in 2019, up from 16% in 2018. How did they accomplish that high jump? A lot of companies are now reducing the size of their board and doing a rigorous effort to replace men with women. Think about it. If you take the denominator down and you add some more women, you can get to 30% fairly quickly. And that's what some organizations are doing. And you may be familiar with BlackRock, wealth management firm that does investments, TIAA. These companies have said, we are committed to doing what's right in the world, and therefore the investments we're going to make are going to be in the environmental, social impact, and corporate governance positive outcomes. And also, we are not going to invest in companies unless there are 50% of the board are women. And here's the other mindset barrier, ourselves. This isn't new to all of us, but there's a confidence gap with women. You know, the data indicates over and over that men have no problem with when they know 10% of a role to say they can do it. And when women know 95%, they want to do more work before they're ready to take the next step. They want to fill in the gap. And what I will say is, oftentimes the way people try to fill in the gap is to get more experience. And here are some ways to do it. Associations, thank goodness to the group that's putting this webinar on. This matters to have a leadership role in an association, in a nonprofit, a human services or hospital realm. And by the way, I have the word chair there because if you're going in, go in big, go in at a leadership level or wanting to get in the leadership stack because that's where you'll be noticed for the next thing. State commissions or boards, hundreds of people are appointed in every single state by governors to state commissions and boards. I'm sure there are some that you care about either personally, I cared about baseball, or you care about professionally. You might care about a certain commission that exists that you can serve on that affects your industry in that state or in another state. Be on the board, a small board of a family-owned business or local firms. Those are great ways to prove you're worthy, but here's what I'll say, is that everyone who's on this call is probably ready to serve on a board if you know how to ask good questions and you're committed to the mission of the organization. And yet we don't just take our superpower stance and say, I'm ready. Now, how do we make sure we're noticed and go forward? You all know the term sponsorship. Go to your trusting relationships. And I don't mean just women in leadership, I mean men. And say, I want to be the one that when somebody comes to you and says, do you know a good woman for a board? That my name is at the top of your list. What do we do? There's a woman named Mika Moser, who's COO of the Tennessee Justice Center. And I love the term she uses. She says, to go into C-suite and on boards, we have to be courageously intentional. Go ahead and ask. Be connected to networks of men who serve on boards. Because I believe, because of the mandates by other companies and by regulatory authorities, our time is now and you want to be ready. Get involved in men who are networks with board relationships. And by the way, ladies, men are still better at networks than we are. Make a request. Just do it. Request a C-suite or board mentor that sits outside your company, but you aspire to be who they are in terms of leadership in your industry or in something else that you care about. And by the way, I was also asked to speak a little bit to how do we make sure it's happening in our own organization? I got to tell you, strategic talent planning about how you're going to make sure that you touch all the networks of communities that you want to bring in bench strength, and you keep that bench strength moving along. It's all real easy to say, and we all know it, but it's what's going to do it. And the importance of a pipeline, like, you know, that whole thing, always be closing in the sales world. I say always be hiring. Even if you don't bring them into your organization, form relationships with brilliant people that you meet of all different ethnicities and experiences. I worked with an organization just a couple of weeks ago who we were going through their direct reports to their C-suite to decide who might be next for C-suite. They were talking about a woman who was ahead in their manufacturing area. And they went on and on and on about her intelligence, her potential, her skill set, her ability to manage others. And then they said, we think she might have topped out where she is. And I asked the question, what else in this organization gives her possibility? Could she be a sales leader? Could she head up industrial design? Could she be a leader in a bigger operation than just the manufacturing area? And it was clear they had never thought about that. Not all of this that goes in silos. Do what we do well as women and think about possibilities all over the firm. And then the last idea that I loved about getting really connected to people who look different from us throughout the whole organization is something M&T is doing. Some of you may do it or may know of it, called reverse mentorship. And that is to actually select someone who looks different from you, who's closer to the customer than you might be in your organization, and tell them you want to do a reverse mentorship. You'll mentor them, which I know so many of you do for other women and men, and also ask them to mentor you. How does it look from their shoes? What can we learn from them? They have so much to share with us about how we navigate the world of equity, diversity, and inclusion. I just say, let's just keep learning from people all over our organization. And with that, I'll stop. I believe I've gone a little over my time, but I've hoped I've planted a few seeds of at least you want to know more and you're ready to do some courageous intentionality. Thank you.
Nancy, thank you so much. That was fascinating. So many tidbits that I pulled out of that. Especially, I really did like your point about the percentage that women reinvest in their families compared to men. That really struck me as very interesting and something that drives future generations of wealth and prosperity. So that was fantastic. Thank you. We will now open it up for Q&A. So if anyone in the audience has questions, please submit your questions into the Q&A box. Patty and I have a few of our own that we have already come up with. And I would like to start off with asking about kind of the age-old argument about the supply pipeline. So we know that executives in corporate America men outnumber women 7-1, and at the CEO level, it's 17-1. Similar in boardrooms, 50% of companies only have one or even no female board members. So is this, you talked about it a little bit in your presentation, is this really a supply issue or a demand issue? And how do we kind of pull women up into the ranks to make sure that we have that courageous intentionality, as you say, to make sure that we fill some of those seats?
Yes, and I think you're so right, Emily, that because we're less confident overall, we're not likely to be raising our hand. And so I really suggest that there are plenty of candidates, whether they're inside the organization or outside. And if you don't feel like you have them inside, and by the way, I would really push for a session with leaders that sit around a table and discuss every single woman in the organization and what their possibilities could be. I would like for everybody on this webinar to think about how many of us can think about a situation where someone gave us the chance to do a job that they had no idea we could actually do. They thought we could, we had potential, we'd proven we could do something else. And they gave us a chance. And I would say that we need to examine for ourselves, when is it that we are not giving that same possibility and opportunity to others? I actually believe that if it's not within, then you need to look outside the organization and decide who you might be bringing in at mid-manager or above, and then or for a board role, of course, from outside, or who is it you need to start bringing in? Like, there's no, it can't be done. It's just, what will it take that will get us there to have the pipeline we want constantly?
Thank you, Nancy. I completely agree. Patty, I'll kick it over to you.
Thanks. So Nancy, obviously we saw in your bio that you sit on several boards, and we learned that you have a love of baseball. But how did those, talk us through how those opportunities came to you, or how you made those opportunities happen for yourself?
Thank you. Patty, you know, it's so interesting, that question, because when I think about the boards I've had the good fortune to serve on, everyone has had a different way in which it evolved, which I think just gives us all kinds of possibilities. So I guess the overriding umbrella, I might say, is if you are not working somewhere that values diversity, find some place that does, because that's going to open more doors. I remember early in my career, I worked for a gentleman who, a CEO, where I had some ideas about how we might turn around a part of the business. And I approached him and I said, I have some ideas and I wonder if you'd be open to hearing them. And his answer was no. And, you know, people hear that all the time and stay. Think about it. Mm-hmm. We hope it'll change. We hope I'll get smarter and they'll listen. We hope that they'll ask me to bring my chair into the room. And I just decided I didn't want to spend my valuable time somewhere where I couldn't contribute very well. Or maybe it just wasn't a good fit. And he gave me a gift, because I went somewhere else and I was lucky enough at every move I made in community or in the company that I was around people who believed in seeing possibility in others. I will tell you this story about the baseball authority because I think it's particularly interesting. So that was a governor appointed role. And it was in the early 2000s when we were bidding for the Expos to come from Montreal, who then eventually became the Nats in Washington. Mm-hmm. And we were working in Virginia to bring them to Northern Virginia. So it would still be a Washington situation. But I happened to love baseball. And a friend of mine who knew I loved baseball, who was in the hierarchy and the governors, knew. And so he asked me one day if I'd like to go on this authority that's going to do that. And I went, yes. And so the first night of the meeting, I got off the elevator at the building with a colleague of mine from the community, who actually Bill knows as well. And he's African-American, owned his own business. And he and I got off the elevator and we looked at each other, the woman and the African-American man, and we burst out laughing because we knew we were going to walk into a room that looked just like 12 Angry Men, and that the governor had decided this shall be. and was beginning to put people of more diverse experience on these boards or commissions. But I will say that every single time I got a role, it was either because I had networked well enough that people knew I was looking for great fun and opportunity, or I asked somebody for a chance. That's how I ended up on a charitable foundation.
Excellent, thank you.
We've had a couple of questions come in from people listening, so I'll address a few of those. This is probably applicable to many of us on this call. Advice for those of us with daughters on building foundational courage and drive for future.
I don't know, Emily and Patty, you may have better answers than I do. What I believe is that, and I will tell you, being in monthly calls with Jack Welch taught me this. He told people over and over and over that what we can do most for folks is build their self-confidence. And so when we have daughters who look to us as authority figures, every single moment we can help them step out there and know that they have a safety net, like when they're young and they know that you're with them and that you help them build on their strengths to get there. It just means everything for them and for us. Every moment, almost all of my coaching and my day-to-day work is making sure people are recognizing their strengths and exercising them, because we have enough gremlins that tell us what we need to do better.
I know there's a famous Jack Welch quote where he says he apparently is a rather short man, and he played hockey. And he loved playing hockey, and he was not big enough to play hockey, but he said his mom just kept pushing him and pushing him and pushing him to play hockey. And he never realized that he was too small. And something like that, it really is phenomenal when you think about being completely blind to whatever limitations society is throwing up in front of you. It's fabulous.
Excellent, I love that.
Yeah. Okay, we have another one. Do we have any statistics about how many women want to be in the C-suite? That's kind of an interesting question.
I have no answer to that. I will do a little bit of a one-off on that one. I will tell you that I think some people don't know they want it until they haven't. Many times people, if you think about your career, there are some of us who knew, I want to do this, I want to do that. But for many of us, since the time when we were very young and we said we wanted to be a fireman or a nurse, it's not like we saw this great career path. What happened for us is every time we took an opportunity, another opportunity that looked appealing happened, right? And I remember I was working for a high-level woman in a bank, and she asked me in my performance review what I wanted to do next. And her job was the next level up, and I did not want her job. So I had decided I probably was going to have to leave the company. And I said to her, I don't want your job. I wish I did. I want to keep things varied and learning, but I don't want your job. And she said, well, there's 1 million jobs in this company. And about six months later, I was offered a job that I not only didn't anticipate, but it was in a different market. I went from staff to line. I went from managing 8 people to 400 who spoke 26 different languages. And if you had asked me what I aspired to, I would have never thought that was in my realm of possibility.
Interesting.
So I just think that oftentimes people don't declare what they want to do because they don't know, or they just think it would, actually, I know a lot of women would say it would feel arrogant to say it out loud.
So if I may jump in with one of the questions that Emily and I prepared, because that it kind of segues very well to what you said. So why do you think it is that women pushing boundaries make so many people, both male and female, uncomfortable?
Yeah, I'd love a little bit of a example of what a pushing boundary means in that question.
I think pushing boundaries can be anything. It can be going beyond where we think we should or where we think we're welcome, or walking into the room when we are the only woman or the only person of color or whatever in that room. I think there still can be at times a little bit of a, what are you doing here? And I think it happens to women of all ages, really, whether you're somebody starting out in your career, in the middle of your career, or in the twilight of your career. It just makes some people uncomfortable.
Yeah. I think the beauty of life is to keep everybody uncomfortable. I'm just going to say it. I do my best work when I'm uncomfortable. I think people have epiphanies from pain. And I do think that being uncomfortable is just fine. So I might not be the best one to answer that question.
No, that's a great answer.
We do have another question from an audience member. How do we encourage or build that pipeline of women within our organization to step up and step into those next roles or become more actively involved in leadership?
Yeah. I have one opinion. Again, everything I've said today is one person's opinion, except for the stats I reported from third parties. But for me, I would love to be asked, because what it might mean for me might be different than for Emily, might be different than for Patty. Like what is it that it would take for you to do X? And for me to say how the company could support that next step for me. I think we're going to have as many answers as we are people. And if you've got what I call real key employees you want to do that with, it's very worthy of a very personal conversation.
Oh, I absolutely agree. I mean, I have examples of that in my personal life and my organization as well. I think a lot of times it takes asking the question, and sometimes there are barriers that just needs that need to be met at home or with children or aging adults, that if that could happen for me, then I would be able to take on additional responsibility and move up. So I absolutely think it's worth the conversation for sure.
On our chat, we have another question. It says, for the states that will require women in the boardroom, what happens if the women who apply are not qualified? And will men be fired in order to hire women in order to fill a requirement by the state?
So I might make people uncomfortable when I say this. Why is it that we never ask that question about men? Like, will they be qualified? It makes the presumption from the very beginning that a woman who would take a C-suite role or a board, like first of all, none of us women want unqualified women to sit in C-suite positions and on boards, just like you don't. And if you make a bad hire for one of those, then you own your bad hire. But there are plenty of women who are well qualified that are not sitting in C-suite or boards today. And the data just looks so solid, doesn't it? And the outcomes from putting women on boards and C-suite, I don't know how you deny those facts, that you do not diminish your board or your C-suite when you do that. Yeah.
I agree. This segues a little bit into a statistic that I saw. It was from 2018, but it was 50% of all of the new class of boards in the S&P 500, 50% were women and minorities. So that's encouraging, an encouraging statistic. My question really to you is that fast enough? Or is that showing progress, you know, in your opinion, or in what you have read? Is that getting us there where we need to go?
Well, so part of me is interesting. I don't know the answer, and I'm really so worried about what we've been set back in the last year. But I will also say that I'm I think the slope is going to go like that, because I think the awareness among all people right now is really pretty amazing. And I think that the last 60 years was what got us here, but I think the next 5 years will be pretty remarkable. And I think all of us around the world will benefit from making sure that we have all these perspectives at the table. I actually want to close it with one thing that I hope will help women reflect a little bit, if you don't mind, Emily and Patty, before we close. For women on this call, I want us to really hold the mirror up. And I'm going to tell you a quick story about myself. The lack of confidence that we often bring to the next step or to the requests we want to make. I talk about this a lot. I serve on a number of boards, and yesterday, a man that at the national level who I've known for quite some time and served on a board with came to me and asked me to serve on, for me, what would be a dream board. And I couldn't help myself, ladies. I'm just going to confess that I did what I just said we shouldn't do. The very first thing I said to him was that I was uncomfortable that I didn't know X, Y, and Z in order to sit on that board. And he looked at me and he said, I know, I got plenty of people that do that, but you've got governance, leadership, experience, and you ask the most penetrating questions to get us into the next opportunity. And why I needed him to say that I was worthy after he asked me, but for some reason I did. So I say that because I'm human and I share everybody's pain who might have that issue. And luckily that there are men around us as well who just keep being persistent as I took myself down the rabbit hole.
Well, congratulations to you, and that's fantastic news. We all do share those insecurities from time to time, but I'm glad you ended up taking it. So
Thank you.
We will wrap here. This has been a fascinating discussion. Thank you to Nancy Eberhardt for joining us today, and to my esteemed co-moderator, Patty Johnston.
Thank you, Emily.
Delivery Council, and to the NHDA. Thank you, and I will turn it back over to Don to close us out.
Yeah, that was fascinating. And one comment I did want to make, Nancy, was that the statistics you provided in the beginning were really eye-opening. And, you know, I think for the people that are on this webinar, I think it really had an impact. So thank you all for the discussion. Thanks, Nancy, Patty, and Emily, as always. Thank you so much. And I just wanted to remind everybody, we are going forward with our National Home Delivery Forum in August, on August 2nd, 3rd, and 4th in San Diego. So please register now. You can register on a website for the registration and the hotel room. And thank you again, ladies, and well done.
Thanks, everyone.
Take care, everybody.
Bye-bye.